My name is Charlotte Whitmore. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the reliable one, the woman who follows through, who doesn't miss deadlines, who keeps her head down and her standards high. I work in a professional environment where performance is measured, praised, and displayed on dashboards. On paper, I did everything right. People usually see me as calm, competent, easy to work with. Some mistake that calm for softness. Others assume that because I don't dominate a room, I don't notice what's happening inside it. I've never been the loudest voice in meetings. I don't interrupt. I don't perform confidence for attention. I listen, I document, and I deliver. For a long time, I believed that was enough. That if your work was strong enough, it would protect you. If you stayed ethical, consistent, and professional, the system would eventually meet you halfway. This story is about the moment I learned that wasn't true. It's not a revenge story. It's not a takedown. And it's definitely not a dramatized fantasy about winning at all costs. It's a record of what actually happens when performance couldn't protect me from politics, and how doing everything right at work still cost me everything. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through a quiet unraveling, not a single explosive incident, but a sequence of small, reasonable moments that slowly reshaped how I was treated, what I was allowed to become, and what I ultimately had to walk away from. You'll hear about subtle dismissals that were easy to ignore, about roles assigned without consent, about how silence can be mistaken for agreement, and how that misunderstanding can be dangerous. You'll also hear what changed inside me. Not rage, not bitterness, just clarity. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration and without names, because the point isn't exposure, the point is recognition. If you've ever been the dependable one who watched opportunities slide past you, if you've ever felt your work being quietly repurposed while your voice faded from the room, if you've ever believed that patience and professionalism would eventually be rewarded, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. Nothing in what I'm about to share is meant to inspire outrage. It's meant to document a pattern and to show what quiet dominance actually looks like when it's built slowly, internally, and without spectacle. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently, honestly. Have you ever done everything you were told was right and still felt something important slipping away? For a long time, I didn't question who I was to them, because on the surface, the answer seemed flattering. I was dependable. That was the word that followed me from one performance review to the next. Dependable, consistent, trusted. When something complex needed to be untangled quietly, my name came up. When a project was behind schedule and no one wanted the spotlight, I was asked to step in. I became the person people leaned on when they needed stability, not visibility. In meetings, I was the one taking notes while others spoke. I summarized decisions, flagged risks, and followed up afterward. I noticed patterns before they became problems. I fixed things before they broke loudly enough to embarrass anyone else. And because I did it calmly, without complaint or drama, it reinforced a certain image. Charlotte will handle it. Charlotte doesn't need recognition. Charlotte doesn't mind. That last one was never said out loud, but it was assumed. I wasn't ignored in a hostile way. That's important. There was no cruelty, no overt dismissal. In fact, people were polite, friendly, sometimes even warm. They trusted me with responsibility, but not with authority. With labor, but not with influence. I was invited to execute decisions, not shape them. At the time, I told myself this was just how organizations worked. Someone had to be the steady center. Someone had to keep things moving while others debated. And I believed, truly believed, that if I continued to perform at a high level, the perception would eventually adjust, that my role would expand naturally, earned through consistency. I didn't see invisibility as a warning sign, I saw it as a phase. When new leadership arrived, I onboarded them. When strategies shifted, I adapted. When colleagues left, their responsibilities often landed quietly on my desk. I absorbed them without resistance, because resistance felt unprofessional, because I was proud of being capable, because I thought being indispensable was the same as being valued. It isn't. What I didn't understand yet was that people don't always see what you do. They see how you position yourself while doing it. And I had positioned myself as someone who would always catch the fall, never stand at the podium. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like neglect. It feels like trust. You're included in the work, but excluded from the narrative. Your contributions are embedded so deeply into outcomes that they become indistinguishable from the system itself. And systems don't get promoted. People do. I remember watching less experienced colleagues speak confidently about projects I had quietly stabilized. They weren't lying, they just didn't see the scaffolding underneath. And because I hadn't insisted on visibility, no one corrected the story. That's how perception solidifies. Not through malice, but through repetition. I became the backbone, and backbones are not meant to be seen. There was also something else at play, something harder to admit. My calmness made others comfortable. My lack of ego reassured them. I didn't threaten anyone's position or narrative. I didn't compete for attention. In environments shaped by subtle politics, that made me useful and safe. But safety has a cost. The more reliable I became, the more predictable I was. And predictability, I would later learn, invites assumptions. That I would always say yes, that I would always adjust, that I would always prioritize the collective over myself. None of this felt wrong at the time. I wasn't resentful, I wasn't angry. I was proud of my work, proud of my reputation, proud that when something mattered, I was trusted with it. What I didn't realize was that trust without visibility is a ceiling disguised as stability. To them, I was steady. To me, I was still becoming. Those two things were drifting apart, and I didn't notice the gap yet. Not until something small happened. Something easy to dismiss, something no one else remembered. But I did. The first moment didn't arrive with tension. There was no argument, no raised voices, no sudden shift in tone. That's why it stayed with me. It happened during a routine planning meeting. One of those long, circular conversations where nothing dramatic is decided, but everything important is shaped. I had spent the previous week preparing a detailed risk assessment for an upcoming initiative. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I could see where things might fracture later. It was thorough, calm, and practical. Exactly the kind of contribution I had been praised for before. When the meeting reached the section I had prepared for, I spoke briefly. No monologue, no theatrics. Just the key points. I flagged a dependency that could become a bottleneck. I suggested a sequencing change that would save time downstream. There was a pause. Then the discussion moved on. Not dismissed, just bypassed. As if my words had landed slightly off frequency, audible but not absorbing. Someone else spoke next, reframing a watered-down version of what I had just said. That version was acknowledged, nodded at, written down. I told myself it was nothing. These things happen in meetings all the time. People miss things. Conversations flow unevenly. I didn't need to correct it. Doing so would have felt petty. And I had always believed that insisting on credit was a distraction from the work itself. So I stayed quiet. Later, when the follow-up notes went out, my original concern appeared, paraphrased, unattributed, and detached from the reasoning behind it. My name wasn't mentioned. Again, this wasn't unusual. I had never expected footnotes. But something about it felt new. Not painful, just disorienting. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Small ones, manageable ones. A suggestion acknowledged only when repeated by someone else. A decision was explained to me that I had helped the architect. A conversation where my role was described as supportive, despite the fact that I had led the execution. Each time I rationalized it. They're under pressure, they didn't mean it that way. It's not personal. And maybe it wasn't. That's the uncomfortable part. Disrespect doesn't always arrive with intent. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption that you'll understand, that you won't mind, that you'll adapt. I noticed that when timelines were discussed, people looked to me for confirmation, but not for opinion. When outcomes were reviewed, my work was praised collectively, never specifically. I was being relied on heavily, but referenced lightly. Still, I didn't push back. I believed in proportional response. I believed in choosing my battles. And this felt too small to challenge. I had seen people derail their credibility over less. I didn't want to be seen as sensitive or territorial. I told myself that maturity meant absorbing these moments without flinching. What I didn't realize was that every unchallenged moment was being recorded. Not by me, but by them. Each time I stayed quiet, it confirmed a version of me that was easier to manage. A version that would not interrupt the narrative. a version that would not complicate the room. There's a subtle difference between being overlooked and being edited out. I was experiencing the second, but I didn't have the language for it yet. I remember walking back to my desk after one of those meetings and feeling oddly hollow. Not angry, not sad, just compressed, as if I had made myself smaller without noticing. I opened my notebook and wrote down what had happened. Not emotionally, just factually. Time, context, outcome. I didn't know why I did that. It wasn't strategic yet, it was instinctual. A way of grounding myself in reality when the room had quietly rewritten it. No one else noticed that first small cut. There was no blood, no reaction, but I felt it. And once you feel something like that, you start seeing the pattern. What makes subtle disrespect so effective is how reasonable it feels in the moment. By the time I noticed the pattern clearly, I had already explained it away dozens of times. Each instance, on its own, was small enough to justify. Together, they formed a rhythm, and rhythms, once established, are hard to interrupt without sounding out of sync. I became very good at rationalizing. When my ideas were acknowledged only after being repeated by someone else, I told myself it was just conversational overlap. When I was asked to help finalize decisions I had largely shaped, I framed it as collaboration. When my workload increased without a corresponding shift in authority, I called it trust. I normalized it because everyone else did. No one around me seemed alarmed. In fact, from the outside, things looked stable. I was included. I was busy. I was praised. That made it difficult to name what felt wrong without sounding ungrateful. And gratitude, in professional settings, is often used as a silencer. If you're valued, you shouldn't complain. If you're trusted, you shouldn't question. So I didn't. I adjusted instead. I refined my language to be more neutral. I softened my phrasing to avoid sounding assertive. I waited longer to speak in meetings, letting others go first. I told myself I was being strategic, observing the room, reading dynamics. But there was also something else happening. I was shrinking my presence to fit the role that seemed most acceptable, and the room rewarded me for it. The quieter I became, the smoother things went. The less I challenged assumptions, the more harmonious the meetings felt. People thanked me for being easy to work with, for being grounded, for keeping things moving. Those compliments landed strangely. They were kind, but they also carried an expectation. Stay this way, don't disrupt, don't demand. There's a particular moment I remember clearly. A colleague, well-meaning, smiling, told me, "You're such a rock, nothing seems to faze you." It was meant as praise. I smiled and thanked them. But inside, something tightened. Rocks don't move. Rocks don't choose direction. Rocks are there to support weight. I started noticing how often my calmness was used as a stabilizer for other people's uncertainty. If a plan was rushed, I was expected to smooth it out. If communication broke down, I was asked to translate. If tensions rose, I was positioned as the neutral buffer. None of this was written into my role. It just became assumed. And because I could handle it, because I always did, the assumption hardened into expectation. I also noticed how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. Not in a dramatic sense, no one denied me anything outright. But when future opportunities were discussed, my name wasn't floated. When leadership pathways were outlined, they seemed to arc around me. I was essential in the present, invisible in the future. That's when I began to understand something uncomfortable. Being needed is not the same as being considered. I stayed quiet because speaking up felt risky. Not career-ending risky, but reputation risky. I had seen how women who pushed back were labeled difficult, how calm competence could be reinterpreted as stubbornness the moment it asked for more. I didn't want to undo years of trust by appearing suddenly dissatisfied, so I told myself to wait. Wait until the timing is better. Wait until the next review cycle. Wait until someone notices on their own. Waiting felt professional. It felt patient. It felt safe. But patience, when unreciprocated, becomes permission. The disrespect didn't escalate dramatically. It didn't need to. It became normalized, embedded, invisible enough that questioning it would require explaining the entire history, and explaining always puts the burden on the person who was quiet the longest. I kept documenting, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I wrote down moments, patterns, language shifts, not to use them against anyone, just to remind myself that what I was feeling wasn't imagined. Because when something becomes normal, the hardest part is trusting your own perception. And deep down, I was starting to sense that the role I was playing wasn't one I had chosen. It was one I had accepted piece by staying silent. It didn't happen all at once. Roles like mine rarely do. They form gradually through repetition and relief. Someone realizes you can handle something. Then they realize you won't resist. Then they stop asking. By the time I understood the role I had been assigned, I was already performing it fluently. I was the fixer, the translator, the one who made incomplete ideas executable. I absorbed ambiguity and returned structure. I caught mistakes before they reached leadership. I smoothed the friction between teams without escalating. When something succeeded, the credit floated upward. When something faltered, I was quietly looped in to stabilize it. No one ever said, "This is your place." They didn't have to. The boundaries were reinforced by behavior, not policy. Invitations framed as favors. Responsibilities framed as trust. Opportunities framed as not quite the right fit. Said kindly, with regret, as if the limitation was circumstantial rather than structural. I noticed how often people spoke about me rather than to me when decisions were being made, not maliciously, almost affectionately. Charlotte will help with that. Charlotte can take a look. Charlotte's great at filling in the gaps. Gaps, that word came up a lot. I was there to fill them, not to define where they existed. The clearest realization came during a conversation about a new initiative, one that aligned perfectly with my experience. I wasn't in the room when the initial discussion happened. I was brought in afterward, once the direction had already been set. The ask was framed as collaboration, but the expectation was execution. When I asked a question, calmly, neutrally, about a strategic assumption, the room went quiet, not defensive, just surprised, as if I had stepped slightly outside my lane. Someone responded with, "We've already aligned on that." Aligned, without me. That's when it clicked. Alignment wasn't about consensus. It was about who was expected to shape the narrative and who was expected to support it. I wasn't being excluded because I lacked insight. I was being excluded because my role was to make other people's insights land smoothly. And I had played it well. There's a strange grief that comes with realizing you've been competent in a role that limits you. Because you can't point to a single injustice. You can't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. You're left confronting the possibility that your own professionalism helped build the box you're standing in. I asked myself hard questions during that time. Had I been too accommodating, too patient, too willing to prioritize harmony over clarity? The answers weren't flattering, but they were honest. Still, I didn't confront anyone, not because I was afraid, but because I was finally paying attention. I started listening to how language was used around me. Who was invited early? Who was asked for opinion versus approval? Who was described as strategic and who was described as supportive? Those words weren't neutral. They carried weight, direction, and mine had settled. I was reliable. I was safe. I was not seen as a risk taker or a leader. Not because I couldn't be, but because I had never forced the system to reconcile that version of me with the one it had grown comfortable with. The most unsettling part wasn't the role itself. It was how naturally everyone, including me, had accepted it. No resistance, no friction, just a quiet agreement formed through habit. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every request fit the pattern. Every exclusion made sense. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, based on the signals it had received, and I had sent them. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because when you understand the role you've been assigned, you face a choice. Perform it forever or change the script. At the time, I didn't know which I would choose. I only knew that something inside me had shifted. Not outwardly, not visibly, internally. And once that shift happens, silence stops being passive. It becomes deliberate. The shift didn't come with a decision. It came with a pause. There was no confrontation that day, no final straw. Just a moment so quiet it would have disappeared if I hadn't been paying attention. I was sitting in a meeting room, listening to a discussion unfold around a problem I had already solved twice. The solution existed in my notes, in my emails, in prior drafts that had quietly circulated and then been reshaped without my voice. As people debated options, I felt the familiar impulse to step in, to clarify, to streamline, to help. And for the first time, I didn't. Not out of spite, out of curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen if I stayed exactly where the system had placed me. If I played the role fully and said nothing. The conversation stretched. People talked past each other. A decision was delayed. Eventually, someone suggested looping me in later to sense check the outcome. I nodded. Something in me settled in that moment. Not heavy, not bitter, just clear. I realized that my silence had always been interpreted as consent, that my presence had been mistaken for agreement, and that my willingness to intervene had been cushioning the system from its own inefficiencies. That day, I let it feel the friction. No one noticed immediately. Why would they? The machine still ran, it just made a little more noise. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and didn't feel the usual urgency. I didn't rush to summarize or follow up. I did what was asked. No more, no less. I stayed within the boundaries of my assigned role. And something surprising happened. Nothing collapsed. That was the moment I understood how much extra weight I had been carrying voluntarily. For years, I had believed that my value came from anticipating needs, from smoothing over gaps before they became visible. But when I stopped doing that, just for a day, the world didn't end. It adjusted, slowly, imperfectly. The discomfort I felt wasn't about them, it was about me. I had equated contribution with overextension. I had confused professionalism with self-erasure, and I had mistaken patience for progress. That realization was sobering, not empowering. There was no rush of confidence, just a quiet awareness that I had more agency than I had been using, and that I had given it away in exchange for stability. I didn't announce a change. I didn't set boundaries publicly. I didn't demand recognition. The shift was internal, and it showed up in small ways. I stopped filling the silence automatically. I stopped preemptively fixing what wasn't mine to fix. I stopped offering solutions before being asked. Not dramatically, just enough to notice the difference. And others noticed too, though they couldn't quite name it. People began asking more follow-up questions. Meetings ran longer. Some decisions felt less polished. A few colleagues expressed mild frustration, not at me, but at the process. I listened calmly, without stepping in to absorb it. That was new. I also noticed something else. When I spoke less, my words landed differently. They weren't part of the background hum anymore. They carried weight because they were rarer, more intentional. This wasn't a strategy yet. I wasn't planning anything. I was simply observing what happened when I stopped protecting a system that didn't fully protect me. That day marked the end of my unconscious participation. I still cared about my work. I still acted ethically. I still showed up prepared. But I no longer compensated for what wasn't acknowledged. I let gaps remain visible. I let ownership become clear. And in doing so, I began to see the outlines of something I hadn't noticed before. Leverage. Not power, not control. Leverage is quieter. It comes from understanding how much of the structure depends on what you provide, and what happens when you stop providing it automatically. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Because once you see your position clearly, you can no longer pretend you're powerless. And once that illusion fades, every choice becomes conscious. That was the day something shifted. No one else marked it on a calendar, but I did. After that day, my silence was no longer reflexive. It was intentional. I still spoke when it mattered, but I stopped speaking out of habit. I let questions hang. I let assumptions go uncorrected unless they intersected directly with my responsibility. This wasn't withdrawal, it was precision. What surprised me was how quickly that silence was misread. People assumed I was tired, or disengaged, or quietly overwhelmed. A few checked in with sympathetic tones, asking if I was okay or if my workload was too heavy. I thanked them and said everything was fine, which was true. No one asked whether I had simply chosen to step back. In professional environments, silence from someone who has always carried weight is rarely interpreted as restraint. It's interpreted as weakness, or burnout, or compliance. That misunderstanding worked in my favor, because while others filled the space with speculation, I was paying attention. I listened more closely to what was said, and what wasn't. I noticed who struggled when I didn't intervene, who sought my input privately after ignoring it publicly, who benefited from my previous overfunctioning without realizing it. I also noticed how much information flowed through me. People vented, asked for advice, shared concerns they didn't raise elsewhere. I became a quiet repository of context, contradictions, and patterns. Not because I sought it out, but because silence makes people talk. And I remembered everything. I documented selectively, not emotionally, just accurately. Decisions that were made without me and then handed to me. Credit that moved upward. Accountability that moved sideways. Language that shifted depending on the audience. Still, I didn't confront anyone. That restraint wasn't fear, it was timing. I understood now that challenging a system before you understand its dependencies only makes you visible, not influential. Influence comes from knowing where pressure points exist and choosing if, when, and how to touch them. I let others believe my quietness meant acquiescence. They relaxed. Requests became more casual. Expectations are more assumed. S looped in later and later in processes, but relied on more heavily to resolve issues once they surfaced. The imbalance grew clearer with every week, and with clarity came choice. I could speak up loudly and disrupt the pattern at the cost of being labeled difficult, or I could continue observing until the pattern revealed its limits. I chose the second. There was a moment when a senior colleague joked, "You're so chill about everything. I don't know how you do it." It was said with admiration. I smiled politely. What they didn't know was that my calm no longer came from self-suppression. It came from understanding the terrain. Silence, when chosen, changes texture. It's no longer absence. It's presence withheld. And presence withheld creates tension, even if people can't name why. I began to feel that tension ripple outward. Subtle misalignments, small delays, questions that had no immediate answers. Not because I was obstructing anything, but because I wasn't preempting it anymore. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't sabotaging, I wasn't manipulating, I was simply no longer compensating. And in that space, something else became visible. How little redundancy there was. How much institutional knowledge lived quietly in my head. How often decisions depended on my memory, my context, my connective thinking. No one had mapped that reliance, least of all the people benefiting from it. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself, it waits, it listens. It lets others underestimate it until the underestimation becomes structural. I didn't feel powerful, I felt prepared. And preparation has a gravity of its own. By then, I knew this wasn't going to be resolved with a conversation. The system had already categorized me. Reclassification would require friction, and friction would come at a cost. So I kept choosing silence, not forever, just long enough. Because once you understand how you're being misread, you can decide whether to correct the misunderstanding or use it. What they never noticed wasn't dramatic. There was no secret meeting, no hidden files, no late-night plotting. The preparation didn't look like preparation at all. It looked like the same calm competence I'd always shown, just finely directed inward. Because while my silence was being misinterpreted as passivity, I was quietly becoming very precise about what I knew. I started by mapping reality, not emotionally but structurally. Who depended on which processes? Where decisions originated versus where they were executed? Which outcomes relied on memory rather than documentation? Which relationships were based on trust, and which were based on convenience? It became clear very quickly that much of the organization functioned on invisible labor, on people remembering why things were done a certain way, on context passed verbally, not formally, on continuity that lived in individuals rather than systems. And I was one of those individuals. I didn't hoard information, I didn't conceal it, but I also didn't volunteer it unless it was explicitly requested. That alone revealed how much had been taken for granted. I noticed how often I was asked, "Do you remember why we decided?" Or, "Can you remind me how this works?" Or, "You were around when this started, right?" Each question was a data point. I began to answer carefully, fully, accurately, but without adding the extra connective tissue I used to provide automatically. I let people feel the limits of their own understanding instead of cushioning it. At the same time, I invested in myself quietly. I updated my documentation, not for the company, but for me. Timelines, dependencies, decision rationales, not in a way that violated trust or policy, but in a way that clarified ownership. I learned which processes were formally recognized and which existed only because someone like me made them work. I also started strengthening external signals. I reconnected with contacts I hadn't spoken to in years, former colleagues, mentors, not to complain, but to listen, to understand how similar patterns played out elsewhere, to recalibrate what was normal and what wasn't. Those conversations were grounding. They confirmed something I had suspected but avoided naming. My situation wasn't unique, but it was unsustainable. Internally, nothing about my performance changed. If anything, it improved because I was no longer overextended. I delivered exactly what was required. On time, with quality, no heroics. Externally, the perception remained the same, calm, dependable, non-threatening. That was the part they never noticed. People assume preparation looks restless, strategic, obvious. They look for signs of ambition, louder voices, sharper elbows, visible moves. They didn't see mine because it didn't disrupt the room. It respected it. I also paid attention to language, especially how accountability was framed. Who was owning outcomes versus supporting them? Who spoke in terms of vision versus execution? Those distinctions weren't accidental. They were reinforced constantly, subtly, until they became fact. And I noticed where my name stopped appearing. Not on failure, but on future-facing conversations, planning sessions, early-stage ideation. Those rooms shaped direction long before execution ever began, and I wasn't in them. That absence told me more than any feedback ever had. So I prepared for multiple futures. One where I stayed and tried to renegotiate my role. One where I stayed and accepted the ceiling. And one where I left. I haven't decided yet, but I gathered what I would need for each option. Skills validation, market clarity, financial runway. Not impulsively, methodically. Still, no one suspected anything. Why would they? I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't confrontational. I wasn't withdrawing. I was doing exactly what I had always done, just without the invisible excess. There's a dangerous assumption people make about quiet professionals, that loyalty and inertia are the same thing. That's because someone doesn't complain, they won't leave. That is because someone is stable, they are static. I let them believe that, because the truth was I wasn't preparing to punish anyone. I was preparing to protect myself. And that distinction mattered. Preparation isn't aggression. It's respect for your time, your capacity, your future. By the time I realized how much leverage I had accumulated, not intentionally, but structurally, I also understood something else. Leverage doesn't need to be used loudly. Sometimes it only needs to be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement was coming sooner than they expected. The reveal didn't happen in a meeting. There was no email, no sudden realization sparked by someone else's mistake. It happened alone. Late one evening, I was reviewing my own notes. Not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted to understand the shape of what I had been carrying. I laid out timelines, responsibilities, and dependencies. I followed threads from decision to execution to outcome. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for the truth. And the truth was quieter and heavier than I expected. Large portions of what the organization relied on weren't embedded in systems. They weren't fully documented. They weren't owned by roles or teams. They lived in continuity, in memory, in judgment calls made years ago and never revisited because they worked. They lived in me, not in a dramatic, irreplaceable way, but in a way that would be deeply inconvenient to reconstruct. I wasn't the only one who knew things, but I was the only one who knew how they fit together. That distinction matters. I could see how decisions had been made quickly in the past because someone, often me, was present to connect dots in real time. How risks were mitigated informally. How relationships between teams were managed through trust rather than escalation. None of it was wrong, but none of it was visible. And visibility is what organizations plan around. The private reveal wasn't ego-driven. It didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel exposed. Because I realized how much I had been carrying without protection, without formal authority, without recognition, without redundancy. If something had gone wrong, accountability would not have been abstract. It would have been very specific. And yet, when things went right, ownership dissolved into the collective. That asymmetry was the clearest signal of all. I also saw how my role had become a stabilizing constant in moments of transition. Leadership changes, strategy pivots, departures. I had been there through all of it, smoothing edges, preserving continuity. And because I never demanded formalization, the system learned it didn't need to offer it. That wasn't malice, it was efficiency. Efficiency always leans on the people least likely to push back. The clarity that came with that realization was sobering. There was no rush to act, no impulse to confront, just a quiet recalibration of responsibility. I asked myself a simple question. If I were to disappear tomorrow, not dramatically, just professionally, what would happen? The answer wasn't collapse. It was delayed, confusion, relearning, risk. Enough to matter, not enough to be obvious immediately. That's the kind of leverage no one prepares for because no one sees it coming. I didn't celebrate that insight. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt careful, because leverage isn't a weapon, it's a responsibility. How you hold it says more about you than about the system that created it. I also understood something else then. Nothing I had discovered required confrontation to be real. The system didn't need to acknowledge my leverage for it to exist. It was structural, not emotional. And structural realities don't change because someone disagrees with them. That night, I closed my notebook and didn't add anything else. There was nothing more to document. I had what I needed, not in writing but in understanding. I slept well. The next day, I went to work as usual. Same demeanor, same delivery, same reliability. No signals, no shifts that would raise suspicion. Because this wasn't the moment to act. It was the moment to decide who I wanted to be when I did. I could leverage this knowledge to force recognition. I could use it to negotiate power, or I could walk away with my integrity intact. For the first time, all options were real. That was the private reveal. Not that I had leverage, but that I had a choice. And once you know that, staying still becomes impossible. People imagine decision points as moments of urgency, a crisis, an ultimatum, a door slammed shut. Mine was quiet. By the time I reached it, nothing was technically wrong. My performance reviews were still positive. My relationships were still cordial. From the outside, my career looked stable, maybe even enviable. That's what made the decision so difficult to explain, even to myself. Because the question wasn't, should I leave? It was, what am I willing to become if I stay? I laid out the options honestly, without optimism or fear clouding them. The first option was to speak up directly, to request a clearer role, greater authority, and a seat earlier in the process. This was the path people often recommend, the advocate for yourself solution. But I knew the cost of that path. It would require rewriting how I was perceived, challenging a role that others had grown comfortable with. It would introduce friction where I had been valued for smoothing it out. And even if it worked partially, it would mark me as someone who had to ask for what others were offered implicitly. I didn't judge that option. I just saw it clearly. The second option was to stay as I was, to accept the ceiling, to continue being indispensable without being influential, to trade long-term growth for short-term safety. That path was the easiest to explain and the hardest to live with, because I knew what it would do to me. Over time, the quiet erosion, the internal bargaining, the slow resentment I had managed to avoid so far, but wouldn't forever. Staying wouldn't break me immediately. It would just make me smaller, year by year. The third option was the one I had avoided naming, leaving, not in anger, not in protest, not to make a point. Leaving because the system and I were no longer aligned, and no conversation could change that without costing me something I wasn't willing to give. That option carried risk, financial uncertainty, identity disruption, the discomfort of starting over in a new context where I wouldn't be immediately trusted or understood. It also carried something else, integrity. I realized then that leverage didn't obligate me to use it. Knowing I could force change didn't mean I should. Sometimes the most ethical use of leverage is choosing not to weaponize it at all. I didn't want to extract recognition from a system that only offered it when pressured. I wanted to build in a place where contribution and authority were aligned by design, not negotiation. Once I framed the choice that way, the decision became less dramatic and more final. I chose the irreversible option, not because it was bold, but because it was honest. That didn't mean I resigned immediately. Decisions like this don't unfold impulsively. They unfold with care. I prepared quietly, reviewed finances, assessed timing, identified what I needed to transition responsibly. I didn't announce my dissatisfaction. I didn't seek validation. I didn't hint. I also didn't disengage. I continued to do my job well, fully, ethically, without shortcuts. I refused to let my exit become a performance. That mattered to me. How you leave is part of who you are. What surprised me most during this period was how calm I felt. There was no anxiety spiral, no second guessing. The clarity I had gained earlier held steady. Once you decide not to negotiate your self-respect, many questions answer themselves. I also noticed how little anyone suspected a change. My reliability had become so constant that it was invisible. People don't look for exits from those who never complain. That invisibility, once a limitation, now gave me space. The decision point wasn't a breaking point, it was a release. And once it was made, everything that followed felt procedural rather than emotional. Steps to take, boxes to check, conversations to plan. I wasn't leaving to escape, I was leaving to align. And alignment, once chosen, has momentum. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down, in a good way. There was no rush to act, no urge to announce anything prematurely. I understood now that visibility had a cost, and discretion had value, so I moved carefully, quietly, with intention. This phase looked unremarkable from the outside. I showed up on time, I met my deadlines, I participated in meetings at the same measured pace. If anyone was watching, they would have seen consistency, not preparation. That was important. I didn't want my future to leak into my present. Behind the scenes, though, I was doing something different. I was decoupling. I began formalizing what I could, documenting processes that had lived informally in my head, but only to the extent that my role required. I didn't rush to transfer ownership of everything I knew. I focused on what was reasonable, ethical, and expected, nothing more. Not because I wanted to create chaos, but because I was no longer responsible for compensating for structural gaps that had never been acknowledged. I also reviewed my obligations carefully. Contracts, notice periods, non-competes, everything was clean. That mattered to me. I wanted my exit to be beyond reproach, both legally and professionally. At the same time, I explored opportunities externally, quiet conversations, exploratory interviews, not framed as escapes, but as calibrations. I wanted to know what my experience looked like outside the context that had narrowed it. The answer surprised me. In those conversations, I wasn't supportive or steady. I was described as strategic, integrative, a systems thinker. People asked for my opinion early, not after decisions were made. They didn't assume my silence meant agreement. They waited. That contrast was clarifying. It confirmed that the issue wasn't my capability. It was the environment that had grown around it. Back at work, subtle cracks began to show, not dramatically, but predictably. Projects took longer without my anticipatory adjustments. Questions circled without resolution. People followed processes without fully understanding why they existed. Still, no one connected those dots to me. Why would they? I was still there, still calm, still helpful, within bounds. There's a misconception that silence is passive. In reality, silence paired with action is deeply intentional. Every step I took during that period was aligned with the version of myself I was becoming, not the role I was leaving. I was careful not to burn bridges. I responded to messages. I shared knowledge when asked. I didn't withhold out of spite. But I also didn't volunteer context out of habit. That line mattered. As my planned timeline approached, I prepared for the conversations ahead. Not rehearsed speeches, just clarity. I didn't need to justify my decision. I didn't need to persuade anyone. I needed to communicate it cleanly, and I needed to do it without heat. What struck me most during this phase was how invisible preparation remains until it's complete. People assume continuity because they've experienced it before. They assume tomorrow will look like yesterday because yesterday did. That assumption creates blind spots. I move through those blind spots with respect, not to exploit them, but to protect myself from unnecessary interference. Not everything needs to be shared before it's ready. When the moment came to submit my notice, it felt almost anticlimactic. No surge of emotion, no relief rush, just confirmation. I'd already left internally. Everything after that would be logistics. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about alignment. It's about letting your actions catch up to your understanding without inviting commentary before you're ready. And by the time anyone realized something was changing, the change was already irreversible. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced gradually, the way structural weaknesses always do, quietly, then all at the same time. At first, nothing seemed different. I gave notice calmly, professionally. No accusations, no speeches. Just a clear timeline and an offer to transition responsibilities appropriately. The reaction was polite surprise, a few kind words, assurances that I would be missed. No panic yet. People assume that when someone like me leaves, the impact will be manageable. After all, I wasn't a leader on paper. I wasn't the face of any initiative. My work was embedded, not branded. That assumption held for about a week. Then the questions began. Small ones at first. Clarifications, requests for reminders. Do you remember why we did this? Where does that decision live? Who usually coordinates that piece? I answered what I reasonably could, within the boundaries of my notice period. I shared documentation that existed. I explained processes that were formally mine. But something had changed. The expectation that I would anticipate was gone. And without anticipation, things slowed. Meetings became longer, decisions stalled. People disagreed. Not because the issues were new, but because the connective logic that had previously smoothed them over was no longer present. Threads that had once been woven quietly now lay loose. I watched this unfold with a strange detachment. Not satisfied, not regret, just observation. This was what the system looked like without my invisible labor. What struck me was how impersonal the confusion was. No one said, "We should have listened to Charlotte." No one framed the issue as a loss of insight. Instead, they spoke in terms of process gaps, resource constraints, misalignment. That's how organizations protect themselves from self-reflection. A few colleagues reached out privately, not accusing, just unsettled, asking if I could quickly take a look at something after my departure. I declined politely, not because I didn't care, but because I no longer belonged to the structure that assumed my availability. That boundary was new for them. It was necessary for me. As my final day approached, the tone shifted slightly. Not to panic, but to urgency. Leadership asked more questions. Transition plans were revisited. Suddenly, my knowledge was being itemized. It was too late for that. Not because I withheld, but because knowledge that lives informally can't be transferred under pressure. Context doesn't compress well. It requires time, attention, and acknowledgement. 3 things the system no longer had. I noticed a subtle change in how people spoke to me. More attentively, more carefully. As if something they had taken for granted was now visible and fragile. Still, no one asked the obvious question. Why hadn't this been formalized sooner? That question would have required acknowledging how much had rested on quiet competence, without corresponding authority. It was easier to focus on logistics than on responsibility. On my last day, there were warm messages, gratitude, well wishes, sincere, I believe, and also incomplete. Because appreciation, when it arrives at the end, doesn't change what happened before. I left without ceremony. No dramatic goodbye, just a final handover, a few personal goodbyes, and a closed laptop. The real consequences didn't fully land until weeks later, after I was gone, when patterns that had depended on continuity broke down, when people realized they were solving problems I had quietly prevented for years. By then, there was no one to call. And that wasn't punishment, it was reality catching up. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt confirmed. Because systems don't collapse when one person leaves, but they do reveal what they failed to see. And what they failed to see was never me as a person. It was the cost of assuming silence meant endless support. By the time the realization fully set in, I was already on the other side of it. I didn't hear about the consequences immediately. Distance creates a kind of silence, and I welcomed it. But professional worlds are small, and information travels, especially when something familiar stops working. At first, the stories came in directly. A former colleague mentioned how a project had been delayed unexpectedly, another alluding to confusion over ownership that no one anticipated. The language was careful, abstract. No one framed it as a loss of person, just a disruption of flow. That abstraction didn't last. Eventually, the tone shifted. The words changed. Frustration crept in. A sense of scrambling. People began reaching out more directly. Not to me, but around me. To the contacts we shared. To people who might help reconstruct what had been assumed rather than designed. That was when it became clear. The system was trying to reverse something that couldn't be reversed. Not my departure. I had left cleanly, but the conditions that made it possible. There were attempts to document processes retroactively, to map decisions after the fact, to assign ownership to things that had never been formally owned. All of it was well-intentioned. All of it was late. You can't backfill context that was built over the years by someone who wasn't empowered to formalize it when it mattered. I heard that leadership was surprised by how much friction emerged. that they hadn't realized how many decisions pass through a single point of continuity, that they were reevaluating roles. Reevaluating, that word stayed with me, because reevaluation implies possibility, adjustment, repair. But repair requires acknowledgement, not just of what broke, but of why it was allowed to function that way in the first place. That acknowledgement never came. Instead, there were quiet regrets. If only we'd known. If only she'd said something. As if silence had been the problem, not the environment that rewarded it. I didn't respond to any of that. Not publicly, not privately. There was nothing to clarify. I had been visible, consistent, available. I had delivered exactly what my role asked of me, and more. What I hadn't done was demand, and the system had learned from that not to offer. That's why it was too late. Because the moment for correction wasn't after I left. It was years earlier, when contribution outpaced authority, when reliance replaced recognition, when silence was misread as consent. By the time those patterns are named, they've already calcified. I was told later that my departure had prompted conversations about workload distribution, about knowledge concentration, about succession planning. All necessary, all overdue, and none of it was my responsibility anymore. What I felt wasn't satisfaction. It was a distance. The clean kind that comes from knowing you didn't leave anything unfinished inside yourself. There's a temptation in moments like this to re-enter the narrative, to correct misconceptions, to reclaim authorship, to say this is what really happened. I didn't, because I didn't need to be right out loud. I had already chosen alignment over recognition. The irony is that only after I left did my absence become legible. Only then did people understand the shape of what had been missing. And only then did they realize how quietly irreversible it was. Not because I refused to help, but because help that arrives after the structure collapses isn't help. It's rescue. And I wasn't there to rescue anyone. I had done that for years. This wasn't punishment, it was a consequence. And consequences don't require anger to be real. The conversation happened months later. Not planned, not requested, just inevitable. I ran into a senior leader from my former workplace at a professional event. We exchanged polite greetings, the kind shaped by familiarity and distance. For a few minutes, we talked about neutral things, industry shifts, the weather, new roles. Then there was a pause. They looked at me and said carefully, "We didn't realize how much you were holding together." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a defense. It was an observation, spoken too late to change anything, but early enough to still feel unsettled. I nodded, not to agree, not to dismiss, just to acknowledge that the statement existed. There was no anger in me, no satisfaction. The moment didn't require either. What it required was honesty, without heat. They continued, explaining how things had been harder than expected, how transitions revealed gaps, how some decisions had been revisited. The words came slowly, as if they were choosing them with care. I listened, not because I needed to, but because listening has always been part of who I am. When there was space, I said only this. I was consistent. I did what my role allowed. That was it. No list of contributions, no explanation of patterns, no argument. They nodded again, this time more tightly, as if they understood what I was not saying. The truth didn't need elaboration. It had already unfolded in practice. They asked eventually if I would ever consider returning, perhaps in a more defined capacity. The question wasn't manipulative, it was tentative, almost hopeful. I answered calmly, "I'm in the right place now." That answer wasn't dismissive, it was factual. The conversation ended shortly after, cordial, professional, unresolved, and that was enough. I didn't walk away feeling triumphant. I felt settled. Confrontation doesn't always mean conflict. Sometimes it's simply the moment when two understandings coexist without needing to merge. I didn't need validation. I didn't need acknowledgement on record. I had already reclaimed authorship of my story. What struck me afterward was how anticlimactic the moment was. For so long, I had imagined that clarity would arrive through explanation, that if I could just articulate the pattern, things would make sense. But sense doesn't require agreement. The system had functioned as designed. I had outgrown the design. That was the only truth that mattered. There's a quiet dignity in refusing to perform your own justification, in letting outcomes speak, in choosing not to educate people who are finally curious only because the cost has surfaced. That dignity isn't loud, it doesn't correct anyone, it simply moves on. I left that event with no desire to revisit the past, no lingering need to be understood. The conversation had confirmed what I already knew. The recognition I might have received would always arrive after the work was done. Too late to build a future on. And that was fine, because I wasn't looking backward anymore. Who I am now is quieter than who I was trying to become back then, and more solid. I no longer define myself by how much I can carry without complaint. That used to feel like strength. It isn't. Strength is knowing what belongs to you and what never should have. In my current role, things are clearer. Expectations are explicit. Authority matches responsibility. When I speak, people listen, not because I'm louder, but because my voice is expected to be part of the process. I'm invited early, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. That difference still startles me sometimes, not because I doubt myself, but because I didn't realize how much energy I had spent adapting to an environment that required constant translation, constant restraint, constant calibration. Here, I don't have to soften my insight to make it palatable. I don't have to earn my place through invisibility. I contribute fully, and I'm seen fully. The alignment is quiet, but profound. What's changed most, though, isn't my title or my workload. It's my relationship to silence. I still value it. I still listen more than I speak. But now when I'm quiet, it's because I'm choosing to be, not because I'm bracing for dismissal or trying not to disrupt. Silence is no longer my default. It's one of my tools. I've also become more precise about boundaries. Not rigid, just clear. I don't absorb ambiguity that isn't mine to resolve. I don't volunteer labor to earn belonging. I don't wait to be recognized before trusting my own assessment. Those habits didn't come from bitterness. They came from understanding. I understand now that systems don't change out of gratitude. They change when incentives shift, or when people leave. And neither outcome requires you to sacrifice yourself in the meantime. There's no resentment when I think about my former workplace, only perspective. It taught me what happens when competence is mistaken for compliance, when professionalism is interpreted as a limitless capacity, when good intentions replace structural clarity. I also understand my own role in that dynamic. I stayed too long without naming what I needed. I believed that patience would be read as potential. I trusted that fairness would emerge organically. Those beliefs weren't naive, but they were incomplete. Now I ask better questions earlier. I pay attention to who is invited and who isn't. I notice where decisions are shaped, not just executed, and I act accordingly. Quiet dominance isn't about withholding or winning. It's about discernment, about knowing when to engage and when to step back, when to speak and when silence will do more work. I don't need to prove anything anymore. My work speaks clearly where I am, and if it ever doesn't, I know what that signal means. That knowledge is the real shift. I used to think growth meant becoming more visible within the same system. Now I know it can also mean leaving the system entirely and choosing one that fits. Who I am now is someone who doesn't confuse being needed with being valued. Someone who understands that alignment is worth more than approval. Someone who knows that walking away, when done thoughtfully, can be an act of respect for yourself and for others. And that clarity stays with you. There's a simple story people like to tell about work. If you perform well, you'll be rewarded. If you stay professional, you'll be protected. If you're patient, things will eventually even out. I believed that story for a long time, not because I was naive, but because it's comforting. It suggests that systems are neutral, that effort and outcome are naturally aligned. What I learned is quieter and less reassuring, but far more useful. Performance can earn trust, but it doesn't guarantee influence. Reliability can create dependence, but not respect. And silence, no matter how composed, will eventually be interpreted as agreement. None of this means you should become loud, or aggressive, or cynical. It means you should be observant, because the system is always responding to the signals you send, even the unintentional ones. I didn't lose everything because I failed. I lost it because I succeeded in a role that was designed to remain invisible. That distinction matters. The moral of the story isn't fight harder, it isn't play politics better, and it isn't never be loyal. It's this: alignment matters more than endurance. If you find yourself carrying more than you're allowed to shape, if your competence is relied on, but your voice is deferred, if recognition only arrives when something breaks, those aren't temporary conditions, they're structural signals. You don't owe a system endless patience when it benefits from your silence. You don't have to burn bridges to step away, and you don't need to wait for permission to choose a different future. Quiet dominance isn't about proving others wrong, it's about refusing to prove yourself in spaces that won't see you clearly. Leaving didn't make me powerful, understanding did. And that understanding is something no one can take from you once it's earned. So I'll leave you with one question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Have you ever realized, too slowly, that doing everything right was keeping you exactly where someone else needed you to stay? If this story resonated, I'd really like to hear your experience.